here's your guys' homework on proofs with parallel lines. So, again, you guys just have to look at the statements and then provide reasons for each statement. So we'll begin. So for one, it says A is parallel to B. All right, so your first one for here is given. Now for number 2, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Well, if we know A and B are parallel, and if you take a look at here, you guys, these are interior angles, right? And these are on different sides of the transversal. So we know that these are alternate interior angles. And in your notes, we wrote alternate interior angles are congruent. And that's because if we have parallel lines, then we know alternate interior angles are congruent. All right, number 2. So, given A is parallel to B, we gotta prove angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Well, based off of our statement, it says A is parallel to B, so that's given. Now, we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So it says this angle 1 right there is congruent to this angle 2. Well, looking at your notes, what type of angle relationship is this? Well, this angle relationship, they are vertical angles. And in your notes, you know vertical angles are congruent. So that's why we can say angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, because we know vertical angles are congruent. Next, look at this. It says angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, right? So angle 2 to angle 3, if you look at your notes, that type of angle relationship, those are alternate interior angles. And we know if we have two parallel lines cut by transversal, then alternate interior angles are congruent. And lastly, angle 1 is congruent to 3. So look what we have so far. We have this right here, and we have this right here. So if 1 is congruent to 2, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, we can say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and that's because it's the transitive property. And notice we use the transitive property from lines 2 and lines 3. So there's that one. Now we're at number 3. Alright, so number 3, we have a given statement. A is parallel to B and C is parallel to D. And we gotta prove angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. So 1, that is given, right? That one's given. Now let's look at 2. It says angle 1 is congruent to 2. Why? Why is angle 1 congruent to 2? So let me just mark these to just look. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 because if you guys look at where angle 1 and angle 2 are, those are corresponding angles. And you guys know corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, now let's look at the next line. So the next line says angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Why? Well, if you guys look at those angle relationships, angle 2 and angle 3, they are vertical angles. And you guys know vertical angles are congruent. Now let's look at the next line. Okay, so this line says, on 4 statement, it says angle 1 is congruent to 3. Look at the 2 statements we just proved. 1 is congruent to 2, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So that means 1 has to be congruent to angle 3. And that's because it's the transitive property. and we are using the lines from 2 and 3. Now let's look at 5. So 5, it says, okay, angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Why can we say that? Because angle 3 and angle 4, those are corresponding angles. And you guys know corresponding angles are congruent. Now our last step, so we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 4, right? So look at our previous two statements. We have angle 1 is congruent to 3, and we have angle 3 is congruent to 4. That is the transitive property. And we're using lines 4 and 5. Okay. Number 4. Okay, so we have the given statement, right? And it says A is parallel to B, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Okay. Next, we have angle 1 congruent to angle 2. Well, here's angle 2 and here's angle 1. Why are those congruent to each other? It's because angle 1 and angle 2, those are vertical angles. And you guys know vertical angles are congruent. Now, for the last step, it says angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Well, take a look, right? From our given statement, we had angle 2 is congruent to 3, and for the second statement, we had angle 1 is congruent to 2. So if 1 is congruent to 2, right, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, then you know angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 by the transitive property. And we're getting it from lines 1 and 2. Okay, 5. So A is parallel to B. We know that's a given statement, right? Angle 1 is congruent to 2. So here's angle 1, and it says it's congruent to 2. So why is angle 1 congruent to angle 2? Because angle 1 and angle 2, they're corresponding angles. And corresponding angles are congruent. Next, angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Why? Well, angle 2 and angle 3, they are vertical angles. And you guys know vertical angles are congruent. And lastly, angle 1 is congruent to 3, because if angle 1 is congruent to 2 and angle 2 is congruent to 3, then that just must mean angle 1 has to be congruent to 3. And that is the transitive property. From what lines? We're using lines 2 and 3. Okay. 6. So A is parallel to B, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. That's given. Okay, so it says angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, right? Why? Well, when I look at this, hey, angle 1 and angle 2, those are alternate interior angles. And we know if we have two parallel lines cut by transversal, alternate interior angles are congruent. And now lastly, well, in the given, we had angle 2 is congruent to 3. And in the second statement, we had angle 1 is congruent to 2. So if angle 1 is congruent to 2 and angle 2 is congruent to 3, that means angle 1 must be congruent to angle 3. And that's the transitive property. And we're using lines 1 and 2. Alright, so here's 7. Here's 7. So A is parallel to B and angle 4 is congruent to angle 3. That's given. Okay? Now it says angle 3 is congruent to angle 1. Why? Well, when we look at those two parallel lines cut by the transversal, this transversal right here, I notice, hey, 3 and 1, those are alternate interior angles. And we know alternate interior angles are congruent. Now it says angle 4 is congruent to angle 1. Well, in the first statement we had angle 4 is congruent to 3, and in the second statement we had angle 3 is congruent to 1. So, if angle 4 is congruent to angle 3 and angle 3 is congruent to angle 1, then that means angle 4 must be congruent to angle 1 by the transitive property. And we use lines 1 and 2. Okay, the next line it says angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Why? Well, look at those angle relationships, right? Angle 1 and angle 2, those are vertical angles. And you know, vertical angles are congruent. And now lastly, angle 4 is congruent to angle 2 because of the transitive property, right? If you look at 3, since angle 4 is congruent to angle 1 and angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, then that means angle 4 is congruent to angle 2, and we're using lines 3 and 4. Okay, last one. Okay, so A is parallel to B and B is parallel to C. Why? Because that's given. Now it says angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Why? Angle 1 and 2, those are vertical angles. And you guys know vertical angles are congruent. Next, it says angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Why? Because those angles, angle 2 and 3, they're corresponding angles. And you guys know corresponding angles are congruent. Now it says 1's congruent to 3. Well, if angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, then that means angle 1 must be congruent to angle 3 by the transitive property. And that is from lines 2 and 3, right? These two statements. Next, it says angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Why? Well, two parallel lines cut by transversal. So those are alternate interior angles. And you know alternate interior angles are congruent. And lastly, 1 is congruent to 3, 3 is congruent to 4, so that means we got transitive property using lines 4 and 5. So that's it. Just keep on practicing. Truly try to understand. Remember, for every statement, there's a why, and the reason provides a why we can say those statements. Alright, good luck. Peace.